serious historians, marine biologists, biologists and cryptozoologists of Reddit. As far as legends in history go, what legendary creature do you believe may have been real and probably existed in some way? Or what supposedly legendary person in history was more than likely real? Archaeologist here. There's a really interesting ancient Egyptian story called The Shipwrecked Sailor, in which a man is washed ashore a beautiful island and is apprehended briefly by an enormous serpent. In the story, the serpent tells him that there used to be hundreds of others like him, but a falling star wiped them all out. I think it's unlikely that the Egyptians had knowledge of dinosaurs, but there's a site called Wadi Hittin that has thousands of ancient whale skeletons from the Eocene. I think it's possible they could have seen these skeletons and mistaken them for giant snakes. Herodotus actually tells similar tales of giant flying snakes in Egypt, and I suppose if you saw these skeletons but no trails, you might think they were capable of flight. Changelings, babies switched out by faras, were probably an early explanation for birth defects. Also may explain postpartum depression. Think about it in the olden days. After all, isn't a mother meant to naturally love and bond with their baby, like automatically? So why am I not bonding with mine? Why do I feel like a failure of a mother? Oh, maybe the fairies came and took my actual baby away, and I'm protecting myself from the fairy magic. Mollusca, giant octopus. It supposedly lives in the blue holes of the coast of Florida, and the amount of food and temperature of water both support the theory of an octopus living long enough to grow way larger than we expect, based on our current records. I regularly get to see pods of humpback whales at the beach where I surf. Most of the time, all you see is their backs as they partially surface from the water. Occasionally, one of them breaches mouth first, so you see a giant mouth emerge from the water. Other times, you see a giant tail emerge. If you were watching them and had no idea what a whale was, or that you were looking at multiple of them, I could easily imagine mistaking multiple whale backs as the coils of a colossal snake. I strongly suspect that this is the origin of legends of sea serpents. I've heard of a hypothesis that states the Ragnarok myth actually describes an impact event. The Midgard snake could be an object entering the atmosphere. Very simple mythological creatures like black dogs were probably exaggerated stories of encountering wild dogs in the dead of night. They are often described as having glowing eyes, which isn't an unusual effect when torchlight is reflected in dogs or cat's eyes. The black dog spirits / myths of the British Isles are also likely the grim Professor Trelawney was talking about in The Prisoner of Azkaban. I live in Suffolk, England, where the most high-profile cases of the black dog, or black shuck, have happened. I was over at a friend's house, who lived a village over from me. Her dad took me home, and my friend came along for the ride. Part way home, middle of nowhere, late in the evening, her dad almost swerved to miss something. We carried on, but he was visibly shaken. My friend also reacted to seeing something, and they both described the exact same thing. A big, black, shaggy dog in the middle of the road, staring at them. It was the size of a large wolf, but looked skinnier, and its fur was far more coarse and matted. I was looking through the windscreen at the same time as this all happened, and I saw nothing. The black dog is supposed to give forewarning of a death in the family. I can't remember if that happened, but I do recall my friend losing her grandmother and uncle at around the same time in our lives. I wish I could recall if it was after seeing the dog, but either way, it's a spooky tale. A rock could have been real. It was most likely inspired by the elephant bird of Madagascar. An elephant bat was like a big ass ostrich about 9 feet high. They didn't go extinct until the 16th or 17th century. For sure. Also, even a condor could appear, and probably be misidentified as being twice the size it is, if someone that wasn't familiar with it saw one in the wild. I forgot where I read this, but when people are afraid of something out in the wild, their accounts of it can make it out to be much larger than the real thing due to stress or fear. There are many diseases that the origin of the vampire/vampy myth can be traced back to. However, I think rabies fits it the most. In the olden days, people would tie those suspected of it to trees. In about 3 days' time, the disease would drastically change them. extreme light sensitivity, paleness, aggression, excessive drooling. They could slash would try to attack you, and have bouts of either extreme slow fatigue or even adrenaline. Also, rabies can be passed from person to person through a bite, not just an infected animal. Arthur from the legendary people side of things. King Arthur was certainly someone who actually existed, albeit in a much different form than modern audiences would be familiar with. The earliest mentions of him are as a historical British king who lived during the 5th century. He's in a king list. He's mentioned as winning a series of decisive battles against the Saxons, and his excellent swordsmanship is referenced once, and that's about it. During the Middle Ages, Arthur's tale was romanticized and then conflated with other myths and folklore. Several of his knights, such as Lancelot, were originally heroes of their own legends before being added to his, until we finally ended up with our present version that has all the medieval knights and magic and the round table and the holy grail business. It's entirely possible that the name of Arthur itself was part of this later conflation, as his victories against the Saxons were also credited in some sources to a general named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Those sources may be wrong, or they may have been two different leaders who were mistakenly combined by later writers, a king and his general. Perhaps, among historians who support Arthur's historicity, the thinking goes that he was a Romano-British, i.e. Welsh, leader who fought against Saxon incursions and held them off during his lifetime, becoming ruler of part of Britain in the wake of Rome's withdrawal. His name would have originally been Roman, Artorius, which became Arthurus in the Vulgar Latin, and was later shifted to Arthur by Celtic influence in the 6th century. Troy the Trojan War is another legendary event that was certainly based on something real. We know Troy was a real city that was actually razed around 1190 BC, and we have a lot of evidence that says the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire fought several conflicts over the city, which was a powerful city-state and vassal of the Hittites at the time. The Trojan War from the Iliad is either a legendary account of the most glorious Mycenaean victory in these wars, or perhaps a dramatization of the entire series of wars distilled into one mythical conflict. As for the people mentioned in the stories, though, no telling. Many were likely based on actual nobles from the conflicts, but Greek mythos has a habit of adding in later heroes to famous stories. Combined with the massive time gap before we inherit our earliest surviving copy of the story, at least some of the characters were probably added later. Serious scholarship tries to identify which parts of the Iliad are most guilty of this, and which parts most resemble its Bronze Age origins. My favorite thinking from the historicity debate on Troy is that the whole Helen situation was originally understood to be a metaphor for the actual transgression that the Trojans committed. Hittite letters suggest that they were the aggressors, but don't specify how. So we are left guessing about what sort of treaty violations or trade disputes that Helen might have been meant to represent. The Kraken, the mythological and terrifying creature that lived on the Nordic seas. The legend never clarified if it was a giant squid or anything else, but it's the most accurate thing. The legend may have been created by people devising the bodies of giant squids, 16 meters long, and they supposed it was a deadly monster. The Kraken was born. The Cyclops of Greek mythology. Go Google up an elephant skull. There's this huge hole right in the middle of it looking to all the world like a single eye. Now add this to the knowledge that the Cretan dwarf mammoth left subfossil bones on Crete easily discoverable, was 1 meter at the shoulder, and could be more or less assembled into a giant humanoid. Beowulf, who is featured in one of the most important texts written in Old English, may very well have been real. The epic details what people Beowulf belonged to, the Geats, who resided in modern Gutterland, and Ike. Battles which have taken place according to historians, particularly between the Geats and the Swedes. Most intriguing to me are the facts that the location of Beowulf's burial mound is included in the epic, and that there is what looks like a hill at that location in modern Sweden that has never been excavated. The Maori people of New Zealand have long told stories of the pauke, a monstrous bird that was big enough to hunt and eat humans. Many believe that these stories are referring to the Haast seagull. It was the largest species of eagle ever to have lived on Earth. with weights of around 30 pounds and wingspans almost reaching 10 feet. It lived on New Zealand's South Island and primarily hunted the flightless moa bird, which weighed around 500 lbs. Given the large size of its main prey, it's likely that the eagle may have also targeted lone humans as well. Interestingly enough, the Haast seagull went extinct around the year 1400, not long after the Maori arrived in New Zealand. It's thought that its extinction can be attributed to habitat destruction combined with the extinction of the moa due to hunting by the Maori. There is a child's skull in a museum somewhere with markings on the back and front near the eye sockets. Originally, archaeologists believed it to be linked to violence or sacrifice, until they discovered it matched the talons of the Haast seagull exactly, and that it had been discovered in a pile of bones similar to the piles left by modern birds of prey. Kid was about 6 and got bird snagged. Chupacabra. It has to be some poor sick animal with mange. Mange is highly contagious, so if a pack of coyotes or wild dogs got it, they would all have a weird ass appearance and attack other animals out of hunger. The Norwegians invented high carbon steel. When they were making swords, they would out the bones of predators into the molten metal which added carbon. The fact that they didn't grasp the scientific concept made it even more metal. The Wendigo probably existed, just not as a creature. People in the far north who survived a brutal winter by eating a family member had a psychological escape hatch for the guilt and horror by convincing themselves they were transforming into a ravenous, murderous beast. They'd continue killing and eating in a hysteric delusion that they had no control over it. Wendigo hunters would then have to come and kill them and perform a shamanic ritual to assure the rest of the tribe that the taint wouldn't spread. It's actually an incredibly fascinating study into culturally specific mental illness. The lengths the mind will go to in order to avoid dealing with a traumatic event are so extraordinary that in that culture they would actually continue to murder and cannibalize fellow tribe members under the delusion they had transformed into a monster. There's a very fascinating, but very depressing, segment of cross-cultural legal studies that looks as Wendigo lore also as representations for other horrors, namely family violence and child sexual abuse. I don't have the book on hand, but I remember the introduction was a tale about a girl who is continuously bitten by a male family member. A female ancestor guides her to a riverbank that can treat her wounds with good medicine, but she either forgets or is hurt too many times that she gives up and ends up continuously biting her own daughter. Basically, it tells the story of how abuse and pain can be passed down through families, and how people you love can be both victims and monsters. I think the book was Whitaker Legal Principles. Many myths about sea serpents probably stem from more fishes. They look like sea serpents, are absolutely huge, live in almost every ocean and sometimes wash ashore. I got all that information from a Riv Monsters episode though, so take it with a grain of salt. 1. Based on multiple descriptions of the Australian cryptid, the Bunyip, I firmly believe them to be seals who swam inland. 2. The kraken were likely colossal squid which swam up to the surface. 3. The black demon shark of Mexico is just a large great white with pigment issues. The kraken probably existed. It could just be a colossal squid, but those sailors had to have seen something. The Bearsa bird and the river panther, Mississippi. There was probably some species of large eel-like species that existed in the Mississippi River that has long gone extinct. There are too many concurrent myths describing similar-ish creatures from different places and cultures along the rivers in the North America. Alright, as a historian, giants. They exist in some form over many cultures and history. My favorite story is about a Native American tribe that told the story of the giants that killed them to near extinction generations upon generations ago, and how they were a horrible beast and quite large, all the characteristics of giant. Truth be told, and this is probably true of most legends/accounts of giants, that it's just a height relative thing. A majority of a population was quite small back in the day. Besides being easier to hide and run, less body mass meant less food needed and more chances of survival. But I digress. People were quite small, like average 5-footers and less. Anyone who was taller was probably considered a giant, and all whole tribe of giant people, 5 feet 10 and above, must have been especially terrifying. when they were a warring tribe, or just in conflict with you. So the generational story was just about a smaller height-wise tribe that encountered a taller height-wise tribe and they fought. The story of the giants. The natives have a lot of stories of supernatural creatures that were just odd to them humans. The pale-face beasts were probably Vikings. Vikings caused a whole migration of a tribe as well. It's really interesting in my field of work to just put things in perspective. You gain so much. Edit. Some grammar. But a lot of you seem to lump the idea that all giants were baby elephant skulls. No. This story I referenced actually had archaeological evidence that one tribe versus another in a small area existed with a disproportionate height difference. I'm still looking for the story I'm referencing. Also, the Vikings were a different story. When the Vikings settled in Newfoundland for that short time span, they encountered a hostile native tribe. Some diseases were spread. Some fighting happened the usual. And this native tribe warned their daughter tribe of the white/pale beasts, not verbatim, were coming and they needed to leave the area. This begins the migration of the Anishinaabe that traveled the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes and settled as the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa tribes. This is a condensed bastardized version of the whole story, please keep in mind, and tribe names might be wrong. I feel this post is very similar to one a few weeks ago, but w/e my comment is the same. Camelopard. Described as having the print of a leopard, with this body with a camel, but an elongated neck and too many backwards horns. Nowadays referred to as a giraffe. Many thought it was mythical in certain parts of the world. But sorry that I'm not so well versed on the human history side of this. But hundreds of years ago, the Scottish warriors had myths about their ancestors being giant, brutish warriors. It turns out, what happened is that the Scots found fossils of prehistoric bears which, especially to someone who doesn't understand anatomy as well as modern man, look surprisingly humanoid. They didn't know about prehistoric life, so they assumed these were their ancestors and gave them traditional burials with custom armor and weapons to honor them. You can imagine how the paleontologists felt when they started digging up prehistoric bears with custom fitted armor and weapons. The kraken is totally a colossal squid that grabbed a boat thinking it was a whale. Boats were smaller back then by a large margin. A lot of yachts are bigger than most historical boats. And the creatures that lived long were probably able to get bigger due to humanity not yet having fished the seas near Barren, and not yet having polluted the oceans with massive amounts of propeller and sonar noise.